Everybody. My name is Rob Bennett, and welcome to our first um, installment of our EcoDistricts webinar series. We're really pleased to have you. We have a great turnout today, and I'm really pleased on our inaugural webinar to have Bracken Hendricks of Urban Ingenuity join us. The topic today is making microgrids work. And we're really pleased to have Bracken. We'll get to his presentation in just a moment. Wanted to provide you some context for today. Bracken has long been working at the intersection of clean energy and renewables and energy policy. And the work that we do at EcoDistricts mirrors much of what Bracken does in his day-to-day job. We're all about, as many of you know, about the intersection of sustainability and district scale innovation. EcoDistricts is a 3-year-old organization founded to promote innovative district scale sustainable development. We recently held our first District Energy and Water Academy in Vancouver, BC last fall, and it was that event in which we brought together development leaders, city leaders, to discuss how to advance district scale solutions. That was the impetus for this first webinar. And so Bracken is going to walk us through many of the sort of key issues surrounding microgrid development work, the policy environment, the regulatory environment, and of course how to finance projects in order for cities to start to create distributed utility solutions, both in energy and water. And so we're going to get into it in a minute. Just a few pieces of housekeeping. We have a lot of people on the line, so if you have questions after Bracken is completed, we'll have a Q&A session. I will moderate those questions vis-a-vis what you write down as the questions. We won't be able to go to audio because there's too many folks. So if you've got a burning question for Bracken, please put that in the queue, write those questions down through the mechanism in the GoToMeeting software package, and we will get those questions as best we can. And of course, Bracken is available, and his contact information is there in case you want to follow up with him. One last thing is we are in the midst of planning a couple of key events that we want to let you know about. One is our EcoDistricts Incubator, which is happening in Portland, Oregon, April 19th through 21st. We bring in, and we've been doing this for 6 years, project teams that are looking to advance a district scale sustainability development strategy, and we provide a 3-day executive level training program in which we introduce the EcoDistricts protocol and the EcoDistricts certified verification platform. But we also introduce folks to many of the key leaders in Portland that have done some of the most advanced district scale sustainable development projects in the US. We also have our EcoDistricts Summit coming up at the end of the year, so we encourage you to take a look at our website at ecodistricts.org for details on those 2 events. And finally, we have launched the EcoDistricts certified platform last fall, and so for those of you on the line that are interested in certifying district scale sustainable development projects, we launched this after 5 years in development. It is a global sustainability management framework. It's different from a rating tool. But there's all kinds of details, and we encourage you to start by downloading the EcoDistricts protocol online. So some backstory on the organization and some of the things that we're doing. But now I'd love to introduce Bracken. Bracken is the CEO and founder of Urban Ingenuity that leads their work to finance and develop advanced energy infrastructure projects to help speed up the clean energy future for cities. He's been involved as a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress and formerly served as an advisor to President Bill Clinton and the Clinton Foundation on issues of job creation, energy innovation, and resilient urban development. He's also been involved in establishing the U.S. Department of Energy's Better Buildings Challenge. Many of you may have been involved in that effort. So without further ado, really pleased to welcome Bracken.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Rob, for inviting me in, and Adrian and your team. I'm really excited on behalf of Urban Ingenuity to be supporting the work of EcoDistricts. I'm also joined here by Shalom Flank, who is the microgrid architect for Urban Ingenuity. Together we'll be fielding questions and jumping in, and hopefully it'll be a dynamic conversation. I'm excited that this is the inaugural event and that the turnout is so strong. I think it speaks very well to the kind of capacity building, network building, and cross-sectoral and cross-regional dialogue that can be created. Bringing together regional work and sustainability work is inherently interdisciplinary, figuring out how to produce projects that are economically viable, technically viable, and that actually make good on the environmental and sustainability and resilience promise that is at the heart of microgrids and at the heart of eco-district theory of community-based economic development is a profoundly meaningful challenge. It's quite difficult to pull off, but it's absolutely achievable. And that's really where we wanted to start, with this notion of making microgrids work. These projects are as good as their ability to get built. And looking at some of those drivers is fundamental. The ability to make it through to implementation is a real challenge, and it's also part of the opportunity of really pulling together a community-based theory of change. One of the key things is to figure out how to simplify and cut through the complexity and give the key decision makers the tools they need to take action on the resources they control. And I think that underlying logic is going to go through this whole presentation. And for that reason, we do spend a bit of time sort of talking about the financeability and how to make these things work at a project development level. So with the question of, how do we make projects succeed, there are a number of, there's a lot of conversation about microgrids going on right now. I think the interest around the Energy and Water Academy in Vancouver last fall really showed how much grassroots interest and support there is in building out district energy systems at the neighborhood scale or the urban scale that are responsive to the emerging challenges of sustainability and reliability and just economic development. So I want to spend a minute or two, but not dwell on the current context of the existing energy landscape. And then talk about, for Urban Ingenuity, what is our kind of key theory of change, which is how you layer together benefits. Because we find in project after project that people come to a microgrid and they say, well, it's small, we'll do a little cogen, but they're not thinking holistically about how to access the depth of the benefits that are provided. And it's in this layering that the real power of a microgrid is realized. And then we'll take a few moments to talk about specific projects and how to circle them, drill down, and give them more support. And then think about some lessons for carrying that forward. And throughout, if you have questions and want to fire them forward in the tool, Adrian and Rob will be organizing them, fielding them, and we'll move in an orderly way into a Q&A period. So just a little bit about Urban Ingenuity. We're based in Washington, D.C. We actually run the PACE financing program for the District of Columbia. It's the only dedicated clean energy finance program in the nation's capital, and it's gotten us to focus a lot on how infrastructure gets built, how capital gets deployed to advance energy efficiency and renewables. And we've also been brought in that context as a player on the ground in thinking through how to bring sustainability to things like large affordable housing development projects, working with housing authorities or others. And from that, we're building a sort of a national platform around just and green economic development, working in a number of cities with councils of government and a range of projects, which we'll dig into further. So first, sort of here is just a snapshot of why microgrids, because it's one particular technological solution, but we think it's a very meaningful one. If you look back at the history of how electrification came to the United States, if you go back to 19th century grids at the time when Westinghouse and Tesla and Edison were duking it out over exactly what technology would prevail, energy systems were district energy. They were microgrids. They were built at the district scale. The generation was close to consumption. There were certain efficiencies. There was certain ability to design your load to meet the needs, certain reliability and other benefits that went along with it. Obviously, with economic growth and the electrification of the nation, much larger, more centralized approaches prevailed, which led to a lot of efficiency in capital deployment and led to a lot of benefits. But what we're seeing emerge now is a structure that's really combining sort of the best of both worlds. You're getting much more locational efficiency, much greater redundancy, but these district energy nodes are embedded in a larger regional and national and ultimately global grid network of networks. And figuring out how to access this is one of the huge economic opportunities and the huge sustainability opportunities, I think, confronting any community and any policymaker or, frankly, investor. Again, along with the old paradigm, there's a lot of brittleness, a lot of pollution, and a lot of waste attended with these systems. About 35% of the energy consumed turns into usable energy, in terms of electricity or computing power or heating and cooling. You move into integrated grid networks and, it can be 75% of the energy and up that is turned into usable energy. You have a much lower carbon footprint as a result, lower costs, greater reliability and resilience, but figuring out how to access those benefits is really a key challenge. This is an old slide that I'm just kind of fond of because it was a little bit of a revelation for me as I was kind of putting together a white paper a number of years ago, thinking about how microgrids are really driving information and communications technology out into the physical economy. And we're very, very used to this linear model of energy systems. You have power plants, you produce energy, you send it inefficiently at very long distances across wires, and at the end you have disempowered end users with very little visibility, and when they come online, the power plants just have to turn up production. There's a really interesting thing in managing supply and demand that's taking place today, which is you can manage supply, demand, and the network's resilience at any point along that value chain. And it leads to a whole set of different interventions where you're managing supply in buildings, where you're managing demand at the grid level, and where the transmission grid is suddenly a node of tremendous intelligence. So bringing together all of these systems really becomes an operating system for a transformed economy. And the microgrid is the essential unit of building out this transformed, information-enabled, highly efficient, and deeply resilient infrastructure to support the local and the national economy. So we have this diversity of benefits from environmental sustainability, which will be obvious to many people on the call, community benefits driving locally based investment close to jobs, close to local businesses, but also operational benefits, both in the grid, but also at the facility level. If you're working with a university campus or an affordable housing project, there is an opportunity to run a more efficient operation, and that translates both into capital budget savings and operating budget savings. And accessing those economics is really the key here. And it's this optimization around the whole network that really unlocks those economics. So this leads us to a theory about how to layer benefits together. And I think the phrase "think like a developer" is really valuable here, because ultimately this is bricks and mortar stuff that has to be built by someone. Someone has to take a risk and make multi-million-dollar investments. And very often the kind of systemic and holistic planning that's required to get these things built is precluded because people are scared at the early stages of a zoning process or a redevelopment effort, and they end up cutting corners and not thinking about how to plan toward a multi-user optimized microgrid that can be islanded, that brings energy efficiency and renewables together with controls. But if you think like a developer, it's actually, there is a language that is very common. And it's about, they are used to taking a piece of land and layering multiple benefits about rental streams, optimizing capital investments, figuring out how to bring in multiple users who are going to access various layers of potential revenue. They're going to make capital investments in order to receive a return. And if you think holistically about a complex economic development project, instead of thinking of just multiple vertical layers of development, a microgrid becomes another source of capital investment and another source of revenue. It just operates on a horizontal plane serving multiple developers within the district. And it brings a lot of value to that larger development. And that's the language that I think we have to learn to speak. So this diagram, I'll give credit to Shalom, who's sitting here with me, to sort of thinking through systemically. If you work from the top to the bottom, there's a number of ways to bring together these layers of value in the energy and investment revenues, just sort of optimizing the energy project at hand. Are you trying to build a cogen project just for thermal energy? Well, what if you could add in more electricity load? What if you could design a bigger project and make it more efficient? What if you could capture economies of scale so that you have smaller capital investments and larger revenues? And what if you could play with a capital stack so that you're unlocking huge economic value? That's that left-hand column. In the middle, you have a whole series of new revenue streams, because this installation is actually going to be providing value across the entire regional grid network. So how can you optimize how you integrate with the regional grid? How can you provide ancillary services for a whole range of things of managing voltage and regulating the energy on the grid? How can you address load curtailment in the event of surges of power? How can you effectively bring in very high penetrations of renewables, but manage against the intermittency impacts that the utilities are scared of, by creating a buffer within that microgrid? And so you're enhancing and creating new economics in this reliability and resilience zone. And on the right-hand column, this is stuff that's going to create a more marketable project. You're going to have higher power quality, greater sustainability, fewer blackouts, better customer service, ultimately more resilient neighborhoods, and ultimately public benefits that a developer can actually offer to a local government to ensure that public benefits are realized through private investment, which is a tremendous value proposition and one that's underutilized. And within this, we can zero in on any one of these nodes and talk about how to build out better economics, detailed pro formas, and real-world economic outcomes. So just kind of jumping ahead, as we try and make this case, we need to be able to talk about how to serve customers at market rates without adding an expensive premium to a development. You need to figure out how to fund this and use the funding of the infrastructure to take balance sheet costs off of the ledger and provide new revenues. And you also need to be able to show predictably that you can actually deliver these services through contracts, through relationships with customers, and that this is not going to be some sort of nightmare of complexity that someone's signing up to on the front end without having certainty that it can be delivered. But there are numerous ways to get there, and actually once you start digging into it, the ability to deliver comfort to the decision makers is very strong. This is a very, very simplistic top-line output from a financial tool that we've built. One of the things that Urban Ingenuity does is to bring together technical models of projects where we're showing here's the capital cost of building an exemplary project, and here's how much revenue it can bring. And getting this very, very basic level of kind of cost and benefit, but economic benefit, monetized and quantified economic benefit, is very important to build the trust from decision makers. And essentially what you're doing is saying this is an investable project. So what we're just showing here is actually a real output from a campus level project that we've been doing analysis on for a base campus project that we then optimize and look beyond it at how to bring in other surrounding projects. But we're basically showing, we put together a very simple cost model to build out, 2 megawatt cogen plants with about 1.5 megawatts of solar, and we're basically showing operating costs here that are well below the operating revenue at the basic tariff rates. And we're showing that there's enough money in this project to cover the capital investment and make a positive return. And importantly, when you do that, you can actually bring in a third-party investor to make those investments. as we translated this to the developer, in this case it was a university, but they were thinking about a larger regional economic development project, you take that basic 5.5 megawatt project with a suite of investments, and you say, there's a bunch of ways you can finance this. You can bring in a third-party investor who basically wants to own that cash flow, and we make a set of assumptions about net present value and how much their cost of capital is, and we show them that there's a very solid net present value to the project and a very, very healthy return on their investment should they make it, and that you could actually run some sort of a RFP and bring in someone else to own, operate, and manage this system. We also show them that they could maximize those returns by spending out of their own endowment, and by saying, if you built and owned this and you basically contracted out to someone else to manage it, it's a lower internal rate of return, but a higher net present value, and they're keeping all those benefits. And then there's all sorts of hybrid structures where they can arrive at contractually to get to their comfort level in terms of risk and return to build a financeable project. And so this type of thinking starts to translate into the language of a developer, and they can move very quickly from this to what is the per square foot advantage of having a microgrid for my development versus not having a microgrid. Another optimization exercise, this is from another real-world project, a different one, but we looked across multiple cogen plants that were being built as these sort of district energy centers as a project was built out. And we did a series of exercises where we optimized the capital deployment, and in fact, spending more money in this case led to higher returns because we were bringing in, maximizing the amount of solar deployed, but we were doing it smart. So instead of building 4 plants, we realized at a certain point that they could build 3 and interconnect them and have to pay for less equipment. They're building a more and more robust system, but they're maximizing the 20-year net present value and internal rate of returns. And these are just the sort of the gross returns, but it's showing that by these district energy systems, well designed, are creating a lot of economic value. And then we also, the T's and the E's have to do with thermal and electric and how we do the phasing. And looking at capital deployment intelligently is going to be another thing that will matter to get things built. So it's possible to have a long-term plan, but start out with some boilers and chillers. As long as you build the 4-pipe system and you get people connected to a thermal loop, and you start planning for an electric grid, you can actually get there. And then, of course, in all of this economic analysis, many, many, many layers of the benefits are assumed to have a zero value. Sales to the wholesale market, ancillary services. We basically try and come in with a very conservative case and say, if you just serve the load of the users that you know you can secure, you can build a valuable project. And then the benefits only get better from that point on. And there's also a technical optimization as well as a financial one. Bring in more renewables, bring in more storage, greater resilience. All of these things can add to a more robust project. This is a comparison of another optimization. If you think from the perspective of a developer, we looked at a district energy network. This is actually an anonymized project from a real building that brought a district energy system into a very high-end, mixed-use, largely commercial office building context. And from that, you can see that the microgrid actually means that less equipment has to be built. Boilers, chillers, cooling towers, standby generators are eliminated because the individual developer can rely on the baseload project. They also have improved operating savings in terms of how they're using less of a smaller footprint. They can actually have more rentable space, and they're getting a whole host of additional economic benefits. And then being able to translate that out into both a capital and an operating cost reduction. These are meaningful numbers that get developers' attention when you say that by eliminating all this capital equipment, each of your individual projects, by relying on the microgrid, is not only more resilient and greener, but it's actually going to produce better cash flows and a better utilization of the upfront capital. And those pre-development dollars are very, very valuable. So offsetting those resources is tremendously helpful. As you continue to layer benefits, these individual sort of system level benefits It improves with design. You're able to think more holistically about the building envelope. This is just an example about the difference between using, individual split systems in each of the units, locking in a, greater inefficiency to having a centralized system. You have much more control, and you also have a much lower operating cost because you've centralized your maintenance and repair. Likewise, the rooftop is a huge amenity. If you don't have to have rooftop units for your HVAC, you can maximize your solar or your on-site water treatment through green roofs or some interesting, innovative combination of both. You can also shift over to amenities that, again, add real economic value on the rentable space. And this slide is doing two things. It's showing greater efficiency in the use of the potential amenity of a rooftop by shifting to a pool, but you're also using the low-grade thermal heat that's available all year round after you've gotten your heating and cooling for your space. You can actually still, heat and cool a pool essentially for free with for 3 seasons, or in Portland maybe you could do it all year round. And then lastly, by thinking holistically about how a microgrid, this gets to the question about not precluding options at the front end. If you're trying to make the microgrid carry the cost of building a thermal loop, a 4-pipe system to circulate heating and cooling around a large district-scale energy system, and you have to carry all the freight of trenching and burying all those pipes and then restoring to grade, that's a very expensive proposition. If it's an integrated part of your larger utility plan, you can, by an order of magnitude, cut the capital cost burden of building a microgrid. So thinking about it early and holistically at the neighborhood scale, as the EcoDistrict process encourages, with strong stakeholder process, this is a huge opportunity. And I'm hopeful that there are some public officials on the phone as well, because this is a place where government planning, an Office of Planning, including consideration of district energy in an RFP process, can drive developers to think holistically when they wouldn't otherwise. Because individual actors have difficulty doing this, but collectively they can get it done. And then there's a suite of additional benefits that probably don't even require mentioning, but market leadership. This is showing market penetration for LEED ratings, and the U.S. Green Building Council has a great rating system for microgrids called PEER that they've recently put out. This is just showing the penetration of LEED, and what you're seeing is that LEED went in a very short period of time, about 4 years. It exploded from being a nice-to-have, costly additional thing for a premium customer to being a basis of competition. If you can't deliver the kinds of indoor quality that you get from a LEED, highly rated building, you're frankly not competitive in a Class A commercial office building at this point. We believe microgrids are headed in the same direction. And microgrids actually can be a benefit in getting your LEED points. We're showing here on the left the points that could be available from bringing a microgrid into a planned project. And on the right, we're showing that a microgrid, cuts by more than a quarter the total greenhouse emissions from the exact same project. So this is very substantial. And you'll notice that even with maximizing photovoltaic, which we're strongly supportive of, a combined heat and power system, even relying on natural gas, fossil fuel, is a struggle for some folks. But the energy efficiency that is obtained creates massive greenhouse gas reductions. And then there's a reliability and resilience benefit. This is just showing at the top NYU campus in Hurricane Sandy, where they had recently installed a microgrid, not really for resilience, but when all of Lower Manhattan was out, they were available. On the very bottom is the Goldman Sachs building. They've got a much more basic kind of a diesel generator system. It kept the building running, but it did very little for the community. It was an island in the financial district where NYU became a community-based resource, where people could come, to charge cell phones for heating and cooling, to manage basic necessities. And an islandable microgrid becomes a very, very different thing from an individual resource. So from this, we start to pivot into how we make this stuff work. And I'm just going to show you very quickly show you some slides of some case studies, and then we're going to turn it over to Q&A. I realize we're at about the midpoint here, so I'm going to talk for a couple minutes more but I'm not going to dwell on any of these, but I'm happy to return to them. So here's just some kind of project level case studies. So this is an example of work that Urban Ingenuity did in the District of Columbia, where the district was really interested in supporting microgrid projects in this early stage. And they said, how can we help? Where might these microgrids appear? How can we identify them, get to them early? So we did a data-based analytic exercise, a kind of a light touch screening with available data, things like planned unit development, zoning filings, or air quality permits, site size, to anticipate where zoning was coming on, where new projects was coming online. You can see the various data sources that we pulled, and we found projects in every ward of the District of Columbia. Those are our, I don't know if you call them counties or boroughs, but we found significant number, no fewer than 3 in any given ward, and as many as 19. And so this is a screening tool that was done with very, very little additional analytics and existing available data to say, how can we target and deploy and surround these potentials for success? Here's another exercise that we did in the city of New York, where we took a similar benefit sort of analysis and using existing data tied around an existing competitive process, and we went across various solicitations where people were competitively looking at projects. And we did 2 things. We tried to look across multiple proposals as they were developing. This is no longer just pure basic site identification, but these are people trying to put together viable projects. And we did a very light touch and low cost kind of cost-benefit assessment of where these projects were strong, where they needed additional resources, and we enabled local decision makers to think about how to deploy their available resources more efficiently to bring success to as many of these nascent projects as possible, so that they wouldn't just award a single victor, but they would actually support an ecosystem of innovation across the entire city. Here, now going down from that project level, this is a district scale single project, and this is something we did again for the District of Columbia, but working with data relevant to the General Services Administration in the federal corridor of the U.S. Government. There's an existing district energy plant that only serves federal buildings spanning from right next to the U.S. Capitol building, across the White House, and all the way to the State Department, if you're familiar with on the Potomac, on the western edge of the District of Columbia, on both sides of the mall. Right now, it's not a profitable project. It's only serving heating and cooling. Actually, it's basically a steam plant just to the only federal customers. So we did a thought exercise. Again, our goal has been to, what information can we help get access to easily to help make better decisions, to make projects more likely to succeed. So we did a very simple analysis where we said, which commercial buildings are touching that district energy system that could be served with heating, cooling, and electricity? And if you served electricity just to those federal customers, how much money could you additionally bring in? And the answer is that there's hundreds of millions of dollars annually that is untapped. So if you imagine even a small fraction of the serviceable load, you've immediately made a non-economically viable project viable just by layering in these monetized benefits, whether it's bringing electricity to your existing customers, or bringing thermal to your new customers, or bringing thermal and electricity to the whole region with this tremendous resilience. So this is just an example in a very narrow case about how you can bring this integrated district level planning to bear. The last project is the Walter Reed Army Medical Center. It's going through a redevelopment process, and here we help the master developers think at an early stage about how to first define the opportunity and then translate it into an RFP process, so they could bring a third-party owner in to own, design, develop the asset at zero risk to the master developer or the vertical developers, but creating a very nice infrastructure asset for an investor who really wanted to manage that type of an asset. And lastly, here's an example from a pure private case where we started walking through these benefits with a developer. And once they got through it, they said, to heck with third-party ownership. We get these economics. We'd love to own it. How could we step in and actually invest in this? And the light went off for them that this is just another revenue stream from their development. And so they became inspired to actually privately bring this microgrid to bear within their jurisdiction. So we've got a few thoughts. There's a roadmap, and these are the three pieces, and Rob mentioned them at the start. You know, there is a identification and sort of data analytic piece, kind of a technical process about what's a good project. And then there's a legal and regulatory process about how do we get these things built and make them serviceable. And finally, there's how do we optimize them as a financial investment. And bringing together the technical, the regulatory, and the financial intelligence is really, that's the special sauce about making projects work. And you know, we like to do this in a light way as Urban Ingenuity. EcoDistricts is a tremendous platform for convening partners to think across disciplines holistically and make this stuff happen. And I mentioned in the New York example, you know, local governments are also very well positioned to bring together economic development, technical assistance for environment, and regulatory assistance to navigate approvals. And finally, one of the ideas that we're really playing with right now, and we think would be a wonderful thing to introduce in the EcoDistricts context, and we won't be offended if you steal the idea in your community, but we think that extension services, much as agricultural extension services, help bring value to farmers by showing how to bring things together in a particular plot of land. Developers need the same suite of technical assistance to do this financial, regulatory, and technical analysis at the project-specific level, because all of this stuff sounds good in general terms, but it only works if you bring it together in a very specific way for a very specific site and come up with a unique solution. So that's what we've prepared, and I've gone a few minutes over, but hopefully not painfully too long, and hopefully we've got a little bit of a list of questions. So Adrian, who is our stalwart host, and Rob, maybe I'll turn it back to you if you have any questions. And Shalom's been very indulgent here with me, sitting politely with me, but he may want to chime in on points I've missed or to answer specific questions as well.
Thank you so much, Bracken and Shalom, for this presentation. And yes, we do have some questions. I think just wanted to underscore some of Bracken's later points, which is, and this goes to some of the questions that we're fielding around sort of economic feasibility being strong, but then the sort of regulatory environment or those who you would need to sort of bring to the table. That is where many of these projects struggle. And one reason that we launched EcoDistricts, the organization, and we launched the protocol and certified was to try to create the market conditions for upstream partnership development. So the kind of projects that Bracken highlighted, whether it was in New York City or in DC, really sort of underlie the ability to have clarity with your sort of municipal partners or regulatory partners around what the opportunities are. In the case of Walter Reed, really cooking in very early both sort of a performance metric around carbon emission reductions, but also a partner like Urban Ingenuity that can start to build the case and the economic and the sort of go-to-market strategy with the developer in partnership with the city. And that's where we see great promise, but most of these multi-block projects really are hard to pull off because of that lack of continuity and that lack of clarity particularly among city leaders around what the benefits of this work are. We did in Portland many years ago, well, not many years ago now, I guess about 5 years ago, we did a high-level screen with the city of Portland where we looked at 3 sites. One was a brownfield site called South Waterfront. One was Portland State University's existing thermal system, and like Bracken was mentioning with the GSA system in DC, was looking to see if they could extend it to off-takers beyond the campus. And then a third mixed-use district in which the anchor tenant would have been the Portland Trailblazers in the Rose Garden. each of those projects were feasible from a high-level screening perspective. None of them have moved forward because the ability to get the key players, the regulatory players, the developers in agreement and ultimately moving with clarity. And that's I think what we'd like to get into you with, Bracken and Shalom, for the remaining 20 minutes, is to sort of talk about those details. And perhaps I can start by asking, in your experience where you've sort of taken projects from feasibility to implementation, are there 2 or 3 key sort of upfront key ingredients that need to sort of come into alignment, whether it's a policy move that needs to be made, or sort of clarity around who's at the table, and if that is about who's around the table, who should that be?
Well, thanks for that question, Rob. This is Shalom, and my thanks also to Bracken for the usual silver-tongued presentation. One of the benefits, as Bracken described, of the microgrid approach is that you can use systemic level thinking, and you can realize benefits across many different categories. One of the hazards is that means there's a lot of different stakeholders. You intersect with a lot of different regulatory regimes that were constructed at a time when they weren't thinking about microgrids. So that's a little bit of the yin and yang of how this works. So for success, you do need to have a broad approach. You need to be working with stakeholders that have an investment in the outcome, that they have an incentive that enables them to overcome the inertia of the usual ways of doing business. Sometimes that can be economics, but usually economics is more of a threshold case. It's got to pencil in, it's got to be in the black, but that's not enough in order to move a project forward. Sometimes the sustainability commitment is really the driver, and that can either be from a site owner's perspective or can be from a policy perspective. If there are jurisdiction-wide requirements for sustainability improvements, if there is a zoning process that builds in a sustainability commitment, then that can provide the incentive to really push a project in a direction that's different from the last 10 projects they did. In other cases, if you're dealing with critical infrastructure, if you're dealing with a vulnerable demographic, then reliability and resilience may be the difference. It also can open up other forms of funding, FEMA resources, for example, in recovery from a specific disaster. So, as is so often the case with microgrids, it's really site-specific. You have to be able to identify what those drivers are, who the stakeholders are who are going to be able to get you across the finish line. But it also means that you have the opportunity to customize, to tailor the benefits and the organization behind the microgrid in order to realize those benefits.
I have 2 other elements that I'd love to just put out in addition to that kind of regulatory navigating that and bringing the constituents that together that Shalom just mentioned. One is that from a financial perspective, the load is the asset. That if you don't have the ability to control that there will be off-takers. Essentially, the core proposition of a microgrid is you're making a large capital investment up front, you're doing it efficiently, and that there will be a sustained demand for that asset over time. So figuring out how to get it built into the redevelopment planning, into the covenants, into the codes, is really essential to secure that those loads will be there. A second piece is it's hard to overstate how much the perception of downside risk can chill even the most viable project. And if people are worried that this is going to bring complexity and drag down something they know they can execute, even if there's a lot of upside, their fear of a small downside could freeze an otherwise viable project. And really showing that you're actually de-risking a project with a microgrid and that you're bringing more dependable economics and really kind of putting it into, and that some of those resilience and other community-based benefits that Shalom was mentioning, I think would very much go in that category as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And there's some good experience up in the Vancouver Olympic Village project around those issues of both from a policy perspective and requiring hook-in or creating incentives for hook-in that I think we can get folks directed to some of those resources. Question from Chris Carrick, upstate New York. He's wanting to know if there's a rule of thumb in terms of occupant square footage or energy use intensities or gross square foot of occupied space per acre to make an initial determination of which types of settings are amenable to microgrids. So digging a little bit on your feasibility and what you found as far as a rule of thumb of what looks good for the potential for a microgrid project.
Sure. So one of the essential characteristics of a microgrid is that it involves a local distribution system. For energy flows, electricity, hot water, chilled water, condenser water, those distribution systems have a cost per linear foot. They have revenues that correlate with the amount of load per linear foot. So what that means is the density is a microgrid's best friend. If you want to be able to be cost effective in this upfront capital investment compared to the long-term revenues that you earn back, then you want to maximize the revenues, that is essentially maximize the loads, though obviously you want to have energy efficiency and conservation in there as well. And you want to minimize your capital costs, including the capital costs of the distribution system. So one of the parameters you can look at is floor area ratio. How much occupied space is there, essentially per square footage of the entire site or per acre of the entire site. Another metric is the energy use intensity. The normal variation of that energy use intensity within a given climate, whether it's residential or commercial or small amounts of retail, that end use type doesn't matter so much. There are certain categories of usage where the intensity is so much higher that it really matters: hospitals, data centers, and so forth. And there is, of course, a certain minimum size that you need to cover your fixed costs and still be able to be in the black. So as a rule of thumb, I like to see 1 million square feet in a normal project. It can be less than that if you have some of these more intensive energy users. But you can also look, as Bracken was describing for the Walter Reed project, you can look at an incremental rollout. These systems are inherently modular, so you don't have to have all the load online at the beginning of the project if you can see a trajectory that's going to get you there in the end.
Thank you for that. So now Emily Drennan and Brad Swig. Brad, nice to see you online. It's been a while, but both of them have sort of questions related to either unsupportive or complicated state regulatory environments, and in some cases, utilities, electric or natural gas, depending on your part of the country, that may be quite resistant to losing customers. In DC, you have Washington Gas, and you've got partners who have spun district utility companies off of a traditionally regulatory driven monopoly. So can you talk a little bit about, in your work, how you unwind or overcome some of the complications around state regs and less than friendly utility providers?
Yeah, and I talked about downside risk earlier, and this is probably one of the biggest perceived risks is, I'm a developer, I need to get along with my utility, I'm really gonna drive straight into this buzzsaw. Explain to me why. So the first, and I think there's two separate questions. One is a regulatory question, and the second is a more of a business model question. But they both lead to the level of partnership. One of the things that has been really interesting to us as we've dug into this, and we've done work now in a number of different markets around the country, the market context is very state and local government regulatory context specific, which evolved, as Shalom said earlier, over a historic context. What we've always found is that there is a way to move forward, and you need to figure out what that is. There's generally certain things that people are afraid of tripping up a full rate-making proceeding. So can you cross a right-of-way? Can you serve multiple users with a privately owned asset? What is the consumer choice policy at play? And these are real questions, but they're all answerable. Is there an exclusive franchise where only one utility can provide the generation resource or the distribution? In just about every context we've looked at, there is a way of establishing the right level of partnership to solve each of those issues. And in some issues, crossing rights of way really is an issue, but in other jurisdictions, it's just not. And there are ways to deal with it with a municipal permit. At the end of the day, the ideal microgrid structure from a kind of an optimization perspective is a multi-user, privately owned, non-utility microgrid where you have the ability to make an investment, control those assets, serve multiple different users, and then manage supply and demand in an integrated way and add real value to the utility and all of the different layering of benefits that we've described. There are things that we've seen done very creatively using homeowners associations or co-ops so that basically your end user is not a retail customer, they're an owner and a customer. There's a number of different solutions. There's also light touch regulatory structures, DC's exploring, maybe for certain things the Public Service Commission wants to regulate, but for other things, health and safety and interconnection rules are maybe very important, lifeline rates. But at the, it's not a full rate-making proceeding that would be really burdensome and complicating. And I think really understanding how to work with utilities, Washington Gas was mentioned as an innovator in our region who's really trying to think about how to dispatch assets. There are a number of utilities that we've seen trying to do microgrids, but what they're deploying is not really an optimized microgrid. It's just basically putting emergency generation into the distribution grid and putting it on the rate base. And I think what we would want to do in a situation like that is to work with a utility to think about how they could go from that very minimal intervention to an optimized intervention that's going to give them far more value, give them greater visibility into the management and the dispatch of those, demand response assets or generation assets, and show them the upside. And I think that if you approach this strategically, you engage early, and you understand what their core interests are, it is possible to work very closely and help advance the interests of a utility.
Yeah, just to add 2 points onto that. One is sometimes the utility is your best partner in order to overcome those kinds of barriers, and I would particularly call out public power and municipal utilities and also rural electric cooperatives as being particularly good partners. And the other thing is we don't want to downplay this particular barrier. In certain jurisdictions, you may not have the regulatory environment or a supportive PSC or a good utility partner. You really only need one of those in order to find a path through, but this is even if you're just talking about the U.S., there is no U.S. policy around this. There's 52 jurisdictions, counting Puerto Rico, and they're all different. And you really owe it to yourself and your partners when you're looking at a potential project to understand that at the outset. Put this near the beginning of your analytic process in order to understand what your context is.
Thank you. And I'll mention that Brad is from Boston. Brad Swing has both asked some questions but also provided some resources because the city has done quite a bit in analyzing the regulatory environment with the with the state of Massachusetts. So I'll make sure we get some of these resources available and other assessments that are being done, and make connections with all of you to some of the folks who are working on this. There's a question, just a question about the role that PACE financing can play in the capital stack, and whether or not PACE you're using that as part of the package for doing microgrid.
I just want to say at the outset that we did not plant a ringer, at least not to my knowledge, but that's a softball question. Urban Ingenuity are the administrators for the DC PACE program. PACE is an acronym. It means Property Assessed Clean Energy, and it's a very powerful tool. Essentially, at no cost to the public entity, you use the taxing authority of a local government to create a tremendous security around debt investments into publicly beneficial infrastructure that's deploying clean energy. So we are looking very closely at PACE in a number of contexts. Essentially, what you can do is you can finance 100% of a property level investment in clean energy assets, so that there's no out-of-pocket payment. There's no first cost barrier. So you're taking that out of the capital budget, and then you're sizing the debt so that the debt service coverage repayment is offset by equal or greater utility savings. So you're eliminating a capital cost and you're creating free net operating income in the project. So it's a real win from a financial structuring perspective. And we think it has tremendous promise for a number of microgrid assets, and that could be if you have an individual battery storage or ice storage installation at a property level. That's really functioning as part of an energy district, but it's a specific asset tied to one tax ID number who's going to pay a real estate tax to repay that cost. The other place is tremendously useful, in solar, and the list goes on, more efficient heat exchangers, any of the stuff that goes in, the windows, better envelope improvements. But the other place that is very, very powerful is with that kind of, last 100-foot hookup. You've got this behind the meter interconnection of the building into the district energy system. So there's heat exchangers, there may be switch gear, there's a set of infrastructural costs, or even, there may be a 4-pipe thermal distribution system, which is slightly higher capital cost than doing a lowest first cost, split system for your heating and cooling. But you're locking in a much greater long-term efficiency. So you can actually use those energy savings to finance the capital costs. So PACE is really can be a secret weapon in kind of unlocking project level economics, especially when it comes down to a broadly viable project, but then you get to the individual user and you say, help, I got to hook these people up and it's hurting my pro forma.
Great. Well, that's gonna have to be a wrap. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and I'd just like to thank both Shalom and Bracken for taking the time. We're really happy to introduce all of you to one of our EcoDistrict partners within Urban Ingenuity, and they're obviously doing incredible work and helping us sort of build out the early generation of multi-block microgrid infrastructure projects in the U.S. So thank you to the two of them for taking the time. We obviously didn't get to all your questions. What Adrian and I will do is to pull these questions out of the webinar and work with Shalom and Bracken to endeavor to answer those and put that in the follow-up package. We will send you a link to the webinar and an FAQ associated with some of the questions that you have. So thanks again to Bracken and Shalom. Thank you, Adrian. And I look forward to seeing you on our next EcoDistricts webinar series in 2 months. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Robin. Your work is so important. We're really honored to be here.
Take care. Bye, everybody.